Imagine building your entire life around 2 words. You put those 2 words on t-shirts, on coffee mugs, on billboards in Times Square. You end every single show with those 2 words for 19 years straight, in front of 44 million people. Those 2 words become your identity, your brand, your religion, and then, in one single summer, those exact same 2 words become the weapon that burns everything to the ground. The words? Be kind. The woman? Ellen DeGeneres. And this is the story nobody fully told you. Not the dancing. Not the 63 Emmy Awards. Not the carefully packaged comeback story with the neat bow on top. This is the real story, of a 13-year-old girl in Louisiana whose world quietly split in 2. Of a woman who was cancelled not once, but twice by the same industry she gave everything to. Of a secret so big that when she finally spoke it out loud, it literally shifted the course of American history. But here is the question nobody is asking. If Ellen DeGeneres built her entire empire on kindness, then why did the people closest to her describe something completely different behind closed doors? Stay with me. Because nothing about this story is what it looks like on the surface. Ellen Lee DeGeneres was born on January 26, 1958, in Metairie, Louisiana, a suburb that smelled of magnolia trees and quiet conformity. A place where standing out was considered its own kind of sin. From the outside, her childhood looked perfectly ordinary. A warm mother who sang around the house. A steady father who sold insurance and kept his voice measured. The kind of family that looked fine in photographs. But Ellen would later teach us something important. The families that look the most normal in photographs are often the ones with the heaviest secrets. When she was 13 years old, her parents divorced. And with that single quiet rupture, the foundation she had stood on her entire life simply disappeared. But the divorce was only the beginning. Her mother remarried. And the years that followed were difficult in ways that Ellen has only ever spoken about in careful, measured fragments. There were wounds she carried in silence. Experiences she has never fully named in public. Pain that comedy could cover, but never erase. This is the part most people skip. Ellen DeGeneres did not become funny because life was easy. She became funny because humor was the only armor she had. Every joke she learned to tell was a quiet negotiation with pain she didn't know how to carry any other way. Every laugh she pulled from a stranger was a moment where the weight briefly lifted. By 17, she had left home. Not with grand ambitions, but out of sheer necessity. The way young people leave when staying costs too much. She landed in New Orleans. She waited tables. Shucked oysters. Sold vacuum cleaners door to door. Worked in a law office where the fluorescent lights hummed a misery she recognized immediately. Each job a small reminder that the life she was living didn't match the life she felt stirring somewhere inside her. Then one night, almost entirely by accident, she stepped onto a tiny stage at a local coffee house. No plan. No rehearsed material. Just a young woman with a sharp eye, a quick tongue, and a lifetime of pain she had learned to translate into punchlines. The audience laughed. And in that laughter, warm, immediate, and undeniable, Ellen felt something she hadn't felt in years. Seen. She wasn't performing. She was surviving. And the stage became the place where that survival felt like something close to joy. Upbeat jazz. Visuals of early 1980s comedy clubs. The American comedy circuit in the early 1980s was not built for women. It was smoke, dollar bills slid under dressing room doors, and audiences conditioned to expect men behind the microphone. Women who dared to stand on those stages were novelties. Tolerated, occasionally applauded, almost never taken seriously. Ellen DeGeneres walked in anyway. She drove hours for 5-minute sets. She slept in her car between shows. She refined her voice not in a classroom, but in the unforgiving laboratory of live audiences who either laughed or they didn't. By 1982, Showtime named her the funniest person in America. A contest, yes, but a signal? The instinct she had been trusting in those sweaty coffee houses was not delusion. It was direction. Her style was unlike anything dominating stages at the time. Where others leaned into aggression or shock, Ellen leaned into observation. Gentle. Precise. Almost philosophical. She noticed the quiet absurdity of ordinary life and held it up to the light with a kind of amused wonder that felt entirely her own. No cruelty. No edge for the sake of edge. Then came the night that changed absolutely everything. In 1986, Ellen DeGeneres sat on the couch on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. She performed her stand-up, a bit called Phone Call to God. A whimsical, warm monologue about a flea calling its creator to ask why, if God loved all creatures equally, fleas had it so much worse than humans. When she finished, Carson did something he almost never did. He pointed at her. He beckoned her to the couch. That gesture was small. The meaning was seismic. In the language of late-night television, Carson's invitation meant one thing and one thing only: This one matters. The phone calls started the next morning. Managers, agents, producers, people who had never returned a single message suddenly had her number memorized. By 1994, she had her own sitcom, simply called Ellen. America invited her into their living rooms every week, and felt better for it. The girl from Louisiana coffee houses had made herself visible to an entire nation. She had everything she had spent 15 years trying to reach. National fame. Her name on a show. The approval of millions. But beneath the warm studio lights and easy laughter of that sitcom, something enormous was building pressure. A truth she had been carrying her entire adult life. One that the performance had helped her contain, but could no longer hold. April 30th, 1997. 44 million Americans tuned in to watch a sitcom character say 3 words. What they witnessed instead was something those 44 million people would remember for the rest of their lives. The episode was called The Puppy Episode. Internally, a code name designed to keep the secret contained until the moment of broadcast. In it, the character Ellen Morgan walked up to an airport microphone and accidentally announced to a terminal full of strangers that she was gay. The laugh track played. The studio audience erupted. But everyone watching understood with a clarity that needed no explanation: the woman speaking was not acting. Ellen DeGeneres had come out as herself and as her character, simultaneously, on national television. I need you to understand what this actually cost. This was 1997. This was not a world that received that kind of announcement warmly. This was a world where that single statement carried consequences as real and as heavy as anything a person could choose to carry. The response came from every direction at once. Oprah Winfrey, who guest starred in the episode, called it historic. President Clinton praised it. Thousands of letters flooded in from gay men and women across the country who had never, not once, seen themselves reflected on a television screen. Who wept at their sets because finally, someone had said it out loud. But for every letter of gratitude, there was a withdrawal of support. Advertisers quietly pulled their commercials. JCPenney pulled out. Chrysler pulled out. The network grew cautious. And then the ratings began to fall. By 1998, Ellen, the show, was cancelled. The official reason was ratings. The truth was more complicated, and far less comfortable. Ellen DeGeneres had done something genuine and historic. And the industry had applauded her briefly, before quietly returning to business as usual. Which did not include a leading gay woman at the center of a primetime network comedy. She was thanked for her courage. Then she was shown the door. For 3 years, 3 long, quietly devastating years, Ellen DeGeneres was, by Hollywood's reckoning, finished. Her phone stopped ringing. Meetings stopped getting scheduled. The industry that had once celebrated her could not find a single place for her. She was 39 years old. And starting over. Again. There is a particular kind of silence that follows public collapse. It is not the silence of rest. It is the silence of a phone that no longer rings. Of a name that was once spoken in every room, now spoken in none. Ellen lived inside that silence for 3 years. Without the comfort of knowing it would ever end. She returned to stand-up comedy. Back to the intimate rooms where it had all started. It was humbling in the specific way that only a return to the beginning can be, when you have already stood at the top and been asked to leave. But the audiences still laughed. The voice had not abandoned her, even when the industry had. And then came a fish. In 2003, Pixar released Finding Nemo. Ellen DeGeneres voiced Dory, a blue tang fish with short-term memory loss, boundless optimism, and an absolute inability to be discouraged by circumstances that would defeat anyone with a longer memory. The character was, in the most uncanny way, a mirror of something essential in Ellen herself. The refusal to stop swimming. The insistence on forward motion, even without a clear destination. The particular courage of someone who simply keeps going because stopping is not a language she has ever learned. Finding Nemo became one of the highest-grossing animated films in history. Dory became one of its most beloved characters. And Ellen DeGeneres, the woman Hollywood had quietly decided was finished, became overnight one of the most recognizable voices in the world. That same year, in September 2003, the Ellen DeGeneres show premiered on daytime television. The premise was simple. Conversation, comedy, and the dancing that would become its most iconic signature. No sharp edges. No confrontation. Just the warm, generous aesthetic of a woman who had survived enough to understand that laughter is not trivial, it is necessary. The show found its audience immediately. Then it expanded. Then it became something with no real precedent in the history of daytime television, a cultural institution that ran for 19 consecutive seasons, won 63 Daytime Emmy Awards, and made Ellen DeGeneres not merely a host, but a daily presence in the lives of millions. Every morning she danced onto that stage, sometimes with guests, sometimes alone, always with the uninhibited joy of someone who has earned the right to take up space. It was not a gimmick. It was a statement. This is what survival looks like. This is a woman who was told she was finished, dancing on the set of her own show, watched by millions, every single day. She was, as the press eventually acknowledged with something approaching awe, the greatest comeback in the history of American daytime television. The formula was deceptively simple. Ellen was funny without being cruel. Generous in ways that felt completely unperformed. The segments where she surprised struggling families with life-changing gifts. Where she handed checks to people whose stories had moved her. Where she brought ordinary people onto a stage and treated them as if they were the most important guests she had ever hosted. The audience didn't just watch the show. They believed in it. They believed in her. And woven through all of it, on the merchandise, in the sign-offs, stitched into the DNA of every single episode, were two words: be kind. They weren't just a sign-off. They were a promise. An identity. A contract between Ellen and her audience that said, what you see is what I am. And for nearly 2 decades, 44 million people every week chose to believe it. But beneath the dancing and the giveaways and the 63 Emmys, the same woman who had learned to use humor as armor in a Louisiana coffee house was still standing behind the lights. And armor, no matter how well crafted, always has seams. Summer 2020. The world was locked inside its own homes. The machinery of television had ground to an uncertain halt. And former employees of the Ellen DeGeneres show began to speak. Not loudly at first. Not with press conferences or prepared statements. But in the way that truth tends to move when it has been contained too long, in fragments, in whispers, passed between people who had shared the same experience and assumed, until that moment, that they had shared it alone. BuzzFeed News published an investigation in July 2020 that collected testimonies from dozens of former staff. What they described bore absolutely no resemblance to the show the world had been watching for 17 years. Behind the dancing. Behind the giveaways. Behind the warm studio lights. Former staff described a workplace defined by fear. A culture of silence enforced not by policy, but by the kind of ambient dread that settles into an organization when people understand, without being told directly, that speaking up carries consequences. They described racial discrimination. Senior producers making comments that had no place in any professional environment. People being punished for taking medical leave. For attending family funerals. For doing the ordinary human things that employment law exists to protect. And the phrase that attached itself to the coverage, and refused to let go, was the same 2 words that had made Ellen famous. Be kind. It was now the precise measure of the distance between the public performance and the private reality. Her own motto had become her most damning indictment. The story spread with a speed that left no room for quiet management. 3 senior producers were eventually terminated. In September 2020, Ellen stood on her stage, the stage she had built, the stage she had danced on for nearly 2 decades, and told her audience she was responsible for everything that happened on her show, whether she had known about it or not. The studio audience applauded. The audience outside the studio was less unified. The cruelty of the moment, its specific, almost literary cruelty, was its inversion. She had spent 23 years building a public identity rooted in a single idea. That she was the person who treated everyone well. And now that identity was the very instrument being used to dismantle everything she had built. In May 2021, Ellen announced that season 19 would be the show's last. The official framing was evolution. Those closest to her described something less tidy. The joy had gone out of it. And in May 2022, she walked off her stage for the last time. Here's what I want you to hold on to when this video ends. Ellen DeGeneres changed America. Not metaphorically. Not in the soft language of inspiration that fades with the news cycle. Structurally. Measurably. Permanently. The night she walked up to that airport microphone in 1997 and told the truth about herself, she moved something in the culture that had never been moved before. And it did not move back. Studies in the years that followed documented a measurable shift in public acceptance of gay and lesbian Americans that researchers traced, in part, to that single broadcast. She did not merely represent change. She caused it, at enormous personal cost, with no guarantee of survival. That fact survives the workplace allegations. It survives the collapsed brand. It survives the ambivalence. Whatever the final accounting of her character reveals, that fact belongs to history. And history does not issue refunds. She was flawed. She was, by multiple credible accounts, capable of a coldness that contradicted everything her public image promised. She built something extraordinary and allowed a culture to grow inside it that caused real harm to real people. Both of these things are true. They do not cancel each other. They simply coexist, the way all complicated human legacies do. Imperfect, unresolved, and more honest for it. What remains, in the end, is not the brand. It is the girl from Louisiana who stepped onto a small stage with nothing but a sharp eye and a lifetime of pain she had learned to translate, and refused, through cancellation and silence and collapse, to stop speaking. That refusal is the legacy. Everything else is detailed. If this story made you think differently about someone you thought you already knew, hit subscribe. Every week I go deeper on the stories that shape the world we live in. The ones that are more complicated, more real, and more powerful than the headlines ever told you.